Hi everyone, Rob here from the Space Week Ireland team. I'm joined today by my colleague Alan, who is understandably very excited about the Artemis mission. We have to be very careful we don't mention it too often, or you'll chew our ears off at the coffee machine. So, Alan, why are you so excited about the Artemis mission?
Hey, Rob, and welcome everyone. So the Artemis mission is a very exciting mission. Humans are finally going back to the moon. So Artemis itself is a joint mission. It's predominantly NASA, but there are some European Space Agency in there as well. But the mission itself is as I say, it's a mission that's going back to the moon. So it has a what's called an SLS rocket system, which is kind of like the Saturn V way back in the 60s and 70s. Like a very big rocket. Everything else pales in comparison to it. So it's pretty cool. And then you have the Orion multi-purpose vehicle, which sits on top of it, and that's where the crew. That's called a crew capsule. So that's where the crew will sit during their voyage to the moon. And then once they're at the moon, they will be docking with what's called a gateway and a human landing system, where they will then descend down to the surface of the moon. So it's a pretty exciting mission, and it's actually due to launch this year. So one part of it is due to launch this year. So it's actually a very exciting time to be interested in anything space related or even just exploration related. This is one of the cool and epic journeys of humankind, where we love going underwater, but we love going into space. So it's cool to see this kind of a technology being used and developed.
That's very cool. And I have seen some images, and like you say, it does kind of bring back memories of the Apollo era. Like that, I've seen what the Saturn V looks like compared to this SLS, and they do look quite similar. And even the Orion, where it sits on the spacecraft, is quite similar to where the lander sat on the Saturn V. So I'm feeling nostalgic for a time I wasn't even born at, which is an interesting experience. But you mentioned that.
Well, it's interesting, Rob, because for the likes of myself and for probably a reasonable cohort of those that are viewing this particular broadcast right now, this is our Saturn V. This is our Apollo mission moment. This is going to be the first mission to the moon certainly in my lifetime. So for me, this is that. So it's pretty cool.
It is. I mean, it is almost shocking that we got to the moon and then abandoned that capability for 50 years. That's something. It's good that we're rectifying that finally, obviously. But it's obviously going to take stages. We're not just going to pick up where we left off with the Apollo program. So you're saying this first phase isn't going to be crewed. It's just going to be the first mission of several that will actually take us back to the moon.
Yeah. So Artemis 1 is well, it was due to launch in September, and they had an issue putting some of the fuel into the tank. There was a leak, so they had to postpone that whilst they fixed a seal on one of the inlet pipes. Then they were going to launch in October, but unfortunately Hurricane Ian has interjected because that hit Florida. So there was some minor damage done to the vehicle assembly building, which is in Florida, where the rocket was stored. So there was some minor water ingress, no major damage done to the actual rocket itself. But nonetheless, as you can imagine, there will be some repair time. There's still a lot of local issues going on in terms of getting power back to the local people, local population. So, Hurricane Ian has definitely stepped in there and put it off. So they're now looking at a launch window in mid to late November.
Okay.
So somewhere between November 12th and 27th, thereabouts. They're looking to launch it. So Artemis 1 is, as you say, Rob, it's uncrewed. So it will go to the moon. It'll do it's designed to do 3, maybe 4 circuits of the moon and then come back. So it's somewhere between 25 and 42 days of a mission, depending. They have some flexibility as to what they do. The reason that they actually kind of have that flexibility built into it is when they're maneuvering the rocket in actual space, they want to, and in particular the Orion module, because don't forget that's going to be the one that's, once it's in space, it's the Orion only. The SLS and the big rocket, that all falls away, obviously, as you get above the Earth's atmosphere. And once you're going further into space, it becomes the Orion module. They want to do some particular tests with the Orion module, and put it through its paces. They want to try and see where it'll fail and how you can recover from certain failed scenarios. So that's why they're not sure if it'll be 25 to 42 days, depending on how those tests go. And in particular, they want to test the re-entry system. It's the first time that they will be bringing humans back, which will be Artemis 2, back in through Earth's atmosphere, which is a pretty daunting task. Right. And you can't get that wrong. So they want to make sure all of those tests go as smoothly as possible.
So again, Artemis 2 will be crewed, but they won't actually land on the moon. So they'll do a trip around the moon and come back. That's the plan?
They'll be doing a flyby, effectively. So they'll be going to the moon. Again, they'll go around the moon a number of times. They will obviously spot the landing area, which is in the south pole of the moon, for the Artemis 3 crew. But Artemis 2 won't land. They'll do a flyby, and then they will come back home later on. That is scheduled to be no earlier than 2024 at this point. So, there's going to be at least 12 months between Artemis 1 and Artemis 2, at least, if not reasonably longer than that.
So, and it's Artemis 3 is the final stage of this effort to put people boots back on the moon effectively. Absolutely.
So Artemis 3 then is the crewed mission that is going to be boots on the moon. So there'll be 2 astronauts, and the mission itself, so that you're aware, is as described by NASA themselves, is to put a woman on the moon and to put a person of color on the moon. So it's all about inclusivity, diversity, and so on. So it is about full integration. Artemis 3 will have 4 crew, and 2 will actually go down onto the lunar surface. So they will dock with the lunar gateway, it's called, and then the HLS, the human landing system, will then descend down to the moon and then reverse that process to come back up and go home. So the Orion itself only gets you to the moon, and then there'll be a system there which gets you down onto the surface.
That's really cool.
And that system is actually been built by SpaceX. So they're building the HLS, and they're building a portion of the gateway, the lunar gateway. So
it's sort of a mix of public and private and government bodies. It's interesting.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and they're using so the SpaceX are also building in order to get the gateway up there, because the gateway will be reasonably sizable. They're building it's actually a larger rocket than the Artemis, the SLS rocket. It's called Starship, and they're actually testing that at the moment. They've not been completely successful yet, but they're I'd say maybe 12 months away from a proper full test. They've done some inaugural testing, but they've had some issues. But that's normally a precursor to a successful mission. So they're not far behind as well. So,
I mean, this by the standards of the Apollo program, this seems like a very accelerated timeline. I mean, there were famously 10 missions before Apollo 11, and that first step on the moon. Whereas this time around, we're looking at 3 missions to get the boots on the moon. What do you think have been the major developments over the last 50 years since we did it that allow us to accelerate the timeline like that?
Yeah, well, clearly we've learned. Technologically, we've come on, significantly yet in that time frame. In terms of the actual mission to and from the moon itself, so getting up into orbit is not necessarily a difficulty in terms of it's not something you do every day. It's not like normal flight, but it is something we are consistently good at doing. The getting to the moon and having that extended period of time, that's not necessarily something that's new either. So astronauts spend weeks and weeks and even months on the International Space Station, for example. So long extended duration in space is not a problem either. Landing safely on the surface of the moon, that is a bit trickier. That's something that isn't really done. So that's a newer element, but we have done it before. So we're taking all of this new technology that we've learned during the Apollo missions, all of the data we've gathered through the International Space Station, and a whole load of other missions that, for example, some of the rovers that have gone to Mars that actually have had successful landings without smashing into it.
Right.
They've landed softly, they've deployed their robots. So we know that we can do that on other planetary bodies. So combining all of those to put humans onto the lunar surface is the next phase. But why we're able to do it in such a shorter time frame compared to Apollo, it's because we have that knowledge base already built up behind us. So it does make that task no less easy, but the layout of how we get there is definitely shorter and condensed, because we know some of the things we did right, some of the things we did wrong, and we know how to fix some of those problems.
I mean, the timeline is further condensed because I think the previous administration at NASA or in the United States asked that NASA deliver, was it, I think 4 years earlier than they'd initially planned. Do you think that accelerated timeline is going to, help them rise to the challenge, or, does that mean that they need to rely more on private bodies to help out? How do you feel about the accelerated timeline in that regard?
The accelerated timeline, it's certainly initiated a more prevalent involvement of the likes of SpaceX. I mean, don't forget, there are a number of private entities already involved. I mean, the likes of Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Airbus, so on. There are a number of private entities already involved in this, but to bring extra privatization to the likes of SpaceX, I think was a factor in being able to bring that timeline forward. In terms of rising to the challenge, absolutely. I mean, NASA, European Space Agency, you name it, they have pedigrees of rising to the challenge, and rightly so. The timeline that was instigated is a very short timeline. So they want Artemis 3 to launch sometime late 2025. The reality is that it will probably slip to 2026. So they will have brought it forward maybe 2 years instead of the 4 which was asked of them. But they will still have brought it forward. But it's a very interesting means of getting the private industry into it, and it just goes to show when you put the right people in the right circumstances, be it public or private, bring them all together, then that's what we can achieve.
It is truly amazing. I'm just going to briefly share the NASA Artemis website here for anybody that's interested in learning more. They've got a pretty nifty animation on the screen as well when you launch there. So I highly recommend you give it a look. Very, very fancy. But if you scroll a little further down, you can see some of the spacecraft, and the Lunar Gateway, as you mentioned, it does look an awful lot like the International Space Station, and it's kind of serving a similar purpose in a way, in keeping astronauts in quarters while they orbit the moon. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. So there will be habitat. It won't be quite like the ISS in that there won't be the extended duration for astronauts on the Gateway as there would be on the ISS, because they're that much further out. They're in a slightly different level of microgravity, but they're all because of their distance and servicing modules getting to them. So they won't spend as long on on the gateway as they would on the ISS. But as a concept, it's very similar. There will be a cool number of scientific experiments and whatnot planned for it. So there will be those kind of modules, again, similar to the ISS, where you have different modules designed for different elements. There will obviously be a lander kind of section, which will be dedicated to the human landing system and everything that needs. And then there will be a propellant section to basically to fuel the lander system as well as the gateway itself. So that's going to require regular refueling, as you can imagine. So it is going to be quite an undertaking on even on an annual basis, just to get fuel and supplies and whatnot up to it. So
it is cool, though. I mean, it is effectively a near permanent, habituation of our nearest neighbor, which is it's not beyond. I mean, we do have near permanent occupation of the International Space Station now for going on 24 years, I think, if I remember correctly. So it's a big jump, though, like to be able to say that we've effectively set up base camp on the moon. That is really, really just Star Trek stuff to me. It's very, very
cool. Absolutely. And by the very nature of what it's called, a gateway, it is designed to do that. I mean, it is designed to act as a gateway to two locations, basically. One to the moon, to set up a permanent base on the moon, and that is something both NASA and the European Space Agency are keenly interested in doing and studying intensively. So they're looking at timeframes in the decade of the 30s to actually have lunar bases set up, so of some description. So that the gateway is going to be that point where you get there, you go down to the moon. But the other location that they're looking at is Mars. So they're looking beyond the moon as well. So the lunar elements will act as a very good testing pad to be able to go on the longer duration trips to Mars. I mean, don't forget the moon. It's a just over 3 days of a journey for humans. Mars is a bit longer, months. So you are kind of very isolated. So you need to be very careful when you're going to the likes of Mars. It's another step up, but having the lunar base and having the lunar gateway in particular gives us those platform, and in particular those testing beds, to be able to see what works, what doesn't work when we're looking to go to further afield than the moon.
Very cool. And I know NASA have said that if this is successful, they're hoping to basically have annual missions, which is a far cry from the every few years that we saw under Apollo, and 50 years since the last one. That would mark a dramatic increase in the amount of access we have to the moon, for scientific study purposes. I'm assuming that would mean that we get to be a little bit less triaged about which studies get priority, that we can start doing some science that maybe we didn't have the time or the resources to do in the past. I mean, is there anything that springs to mind for you that you're like, wow, we haven't had time to explore that in the past because we were only able to be on the moon for a day or two at a time, but now that we're going back on a regular basis, we can properly look at, is there something like that for you? Is there an underserved area of scientific expertise that we could explore?
Well, certainly the one area of lunar exploration that hasn't really been looked at in massive detail. There have been a couple of missions that have looked at it. Is what exactly is the surface of the moon made of? So the regolith and even just the substructure underneath that. We know obviously a lot of different elements in it. We know there's water ice. We know there's different elements like that, but we're not entirely sure. I mean, we did a number of years ago. We smashed L-Cross into the moon and was trying to analyze the plume that came up from that to see what was further down into the surface. That brings about its own hazards, because we know that there are entities looking at mining, for example,
Mm.
which has its own benefits, but obviously its own detriments. So we need to be careful of that. But in particular, I'd be most interested in what exactly is it made of, and what commonality in terms of its elements are there on Earth, and maybe even other bodies in our own solar system. Where did the moon come from is, a question that a lot of people ask. We have a lot of the answers, but not necessarily all of them. So be nice to maybe get a couple of more pieces of that puzzle put together.
Very exciting. So final question, I guess, before I let you go, Al. They're planning on building a moon village up there. Would you go?
Yes, I would. I'd love to go. Not going to be in my, I'd say I might be a touch beyond out of reach for me, but I'd love to go. It'd be a fantastic opportunity for anyone who would have an interest in going. It really is pushing the boundaries. If you've any interest in, you don't have to be a space nerd. If you have any interest in just exploration, any interest in what's new in the universe, what's generally what's new and happening. What's fascinating about the moon itself is it has a number of elements towards it. It's not just physical, but historical elements associated with the phases of the moon. And as we were talking about recently, Rob, equinoxes and how they can have cultural significances and whatnot. So it has a whole element of the past of humans. So why would you not go? I mean, it's another part of who we are as a species. The moon, you can't get away from it. It's as much part of Earth as anything else. It influences our tides, you name it. So why would we not go explore? It's like an island just off the coast. Would you want to go to an island? I would.
That's a fair question. Okay, I do have one extra bonus question. Very important one. What would happen if you sent a werewolf to the moon?
Interesting question.
Would you have to leave it on the dark side? Would it permanently be a werewolf if it was on the bright side? Is there anyone at NASA looking at this?
I am not entirely sure if there's anyone at NASA looking at this. There may be. I'm unaware of that department. Would you leave it on the dark side? You could do. It'd be very cold. So I would hope it's quite warm in its wool, but it'd be very cold. I probably would be less worried about werewolves on the moon if I were traveling there. It wouldn't concern me.
Fair enough.
I do have a question for you, Rob, though.
Sure.
And for everyone out there. The rockets used in the SLS. So there's 4 of them.
Mm-hmm. They've
all been used on missions before. So my question to you and everyone out there is go find out where those rockets were used. They are not new rockets.
That's awesome. I don't know we're at that stage of being able to reuse. Yeah. That's obviously great for sustainability and everything. So that is cool. I'm guessing it wasn't one of the Apollo ones. That's probably a bit.
It wasn't one of the Apollo ones. No, we're talking a bit newer than that.
All right. Well, I'll definitely look into that. And folks, we showed you that Artemis website in the middle of the chat there. I'll make sure I post a link to it in the description so that you can explore a bit further yourselves. Al, thanks a million for joining us today and having a chat. And guys, if you do have any questions, feel free to pop them into the comment section below on YouTube, and we'll get back to them when we can for you. Or you can always email us at info@bco.ie. We're always happy to answer questions that anybody has about any topic relating to space. I hope you all have a great space week, and thanks for tuning in.